Today we will look at the Revolutionary War, which started with the first shots at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. When it's all over, the American colonies will not be colonies anymore, but a new independent nation, which will present many issues that need to be resolved. It's Revolutionary War. It's important to note that colonists were not united on the independence question. Let's consider the three groups that showed the divided colonial unity. Patriots were those who supported independence from the king. They believed in the writings of John Locke. They believed that all men were entitled to natural rights, life, liberty, and property. They believed that governments were supposed to protect these natural rights, and if they failed to do so, the people could overthrow it. They believed that King George was a tyrant and had broken the social contract with his American subjects. The beliefs of patriots is best epitomized by the words of Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death." Members of this group included farmers, artisans, merchants, landowners, and elected officials. The second group, neutrals, did not want to pick a side. They changed the side they supported as the war's momentum shifted from side to side. Quakers, as pacifists, were one of the most significant groups of neutrals. Finally, loyalists, or Tories, were those who did not want to be independent. They believed that the American colonists should pay for the benefits that came with being part of the king's empire, like having places to sell their goods, the goods that come from England, and also protection from Native Americans. They also believed that those like Patrick Henry and Thomas Paine were traitors. Members of this group included those officials appointed by the king and parliament, Anglican church leaders, wealthy merchants who benefited from British economic policies, aristocrats, and military officers. It is difficult to determine how many colonists fell into each category. Best estimates say that around 40% were patriots, approximately 40% were neutrals. It's important to remember that neutrals were like bandwagon fans. You know, people who are Redskin fans only when they are winning. It's been a long time for these people. Or Yankee and Red Sox fans. They want people to know that they are rooting for a winner. This leaves 20% for loyalists. Many Native Americans sided with the British as British protection of colonists ended when the war started. Native Americans viewed colonists as the bigger threat to their land, so they supported the British. Many African Americans actually supported the colonists, even though the British offered freedom to those slaves who took up arms for the king. Governor Dunmore in 1775 made this offer to slaves in Virginia, and ultimately about 5,000 slaves will serve in the military, which will make landowners in the South very uncomfortable. When the war starts in 1775, a good question is, how long could this conflict really last? You have the British, who are the dominant military power on the planet in the 18th century, who have an alliance with many Native American tribes who want nothing more than for the American colonies to be brought under control to protect their lands. And when we look at the colonists in 1775, we see a continental army who is, untrained, not very disciplined. They don't have many supplies. Very rarely do they get paid, which is going to affect how long many of them will actually stay in the army. Then we have the question of who's going to enforce wartime policy. How well can the colonists work together? We'll address the Articles of Confederation next time. In spite of the advantages the British possessed, there will be a few things that hindered the British war effort. They used a significant number of Hessian mercenaries. These were soldiers from the Germanic states that were paid to fight for the British. These were not always the most motivated soldiers. Also, the British would struggle with the terrain and weather in America, which we'll see in just a minute. And many in Britain do not support the war, especially as it dragged on. The war will last 8 years, and many countries in history, whether it is France and the United States and Vietnam, or the United States and Iraq and Afghanistan currently, discover that people's support for war has a very short shelf life. And the United States does have some advantages. They have the home field advantage. They know the terrain. They know where they're fighting. They also have a cause worth fighting for. What will happen over time is the Hessian mercenaries and many of the British soldiers will come to not care about what's going on in America. And also, the United States will ultimately get assistance from France and Spain, and they will have the advantage of strong military leaders, people like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, and George Washington. Let's remember that the first shots of the war were fired at Lexington in April 1775. To describe the early war for the American colonists in a single word, I might use disastrous. There were few highlights. The only upside was Washington's ability to prevent having his army destroyed by the British. On June 17, 1775, the two sides fought for control of Bunker Hill, with the majority of the action taking place on the adjacent hill, Breed's Hill. The British launched 3 bloody attacks up the hill, with the colonists being able to hold their own, but eventually the colonists were forced to retreat due to a lack of ammunition. The Battle of Bunker Hill was the deadliest battle of the war, with 450 American casualties and more than 1,000 British. And let's remember that casualties include dead, wounded, and captured. In July 1776, General Howe, who was the commander of British forces, would turn his attention to New York City, with the goal of isolating New England from the rest of the colonies and also taking out one of the most important colonial cities. He would defeat Washington with a superior force of 32,000 men to Washington's 23,000. The Continental Army would be forced to retreat through New Jersey into Pennsylvania. This campaign marked a low point for Washington, with many men deserting, and he suffered heavy casualties. His ragtag bunch of patriots seemed no match for the British professional force. Many enlistments were expiring at the end of the year, and there seemed to be little hope of individuals signing on to continue. Washington needed a victory. During the winter of 1776, Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, found himself traveling with Washington's army after another defeat during the New York and New Jersey campaign, and he famously wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington needed a victory, and on Christmas night, 1776, he led his troops across an icy Delaware River to a Hessian garrison at Trenton. On December 26, 1776, Washington's forces achieved surprise and overran the Hessian garrison at Trenton. These men had been celebrating the Christmas holiday and were not ready for Washington's army. When it ended, Washington's attack resulted in 30 enemy deaths and 918 prisoners taken. Also, 6 cannons were seized by the Continental Army at the expense of only 2 American lives. 8 days later, at Princeton, Washington's army achieved another victory, again taking more British life than American and capturing another 200 British soldiers. These victories proved a much-needed boost of confidence for General Washington and his army. In the fall of 1777, the British launched another plan to isolate New England, this time under the command of General John Burgoyne. British troops struggled with American terrain, finding it difficult to move supplies, artillery, and personal effects over long distances. Also, British supply lines were starting to break down, and British soldiers were having a hard time gathering food. The two sides would meet on October 7, 1777, at Saratoga in New York. Burgoyne would eventually find himself surrounded by the Continental Army under the command of General Horatio Gates. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne would be forced to surrender his force of 6,000 men to Gates. The American victory at Saratoga would be the turning point of the war. The impact of the American victory at Saratoga was far-reaching. The British would change their strategy. They would now try to stay near the coast where they could resupply themselves. But the big gain for the Americans was the entry of France into the war. The French recognized American independence through an alliance. This meant that the British were now fighting on multiple fronts, and that the colonists would now reap the benefits of French manpower, supplies, and leadership. The Americans would seize the momentum. The Loyalist uprising that the British had hoped for would never materialize. Over time, Britain would suffer from a lack of support for the war at home, and French reinforcements, especially those under the command of Marquis de Lafayette, helped shift the balance of the war. Also, the Continental Army became a much more effective fighting force under the training of Baron von Steuben, the Prussian-born general who became Inspector General of the Continental Army at Valley Forge in February 1778. In 1781, General Charles Cornwallis, who commanded British troops in the South, planned to take Virginia before moving the war north, thus putting into motion the war's final major standoff. Cornwallis set up on the peninsula in Yorktown in southeastern Virginia. After the French Navy scored a major victory over the British at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, Cornwallis's 7,500-man army found itself surrounded by 17,000 French and American troops, with no way to resupply itself. The siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks until Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 19, 1781. While the war would continue into 1783, Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown effectively ended the war. It is worth taking a moment to make sure we understand the accomplishments of 2 men, without whom victory might have proven impossible. George Washington was given command of the Continental Army by the Second Continental Congress. There were few great battlefield triumphs under Washington's command, but he managed to keep this ragtag group of patriots together that ultimately defeated the British. Ben Franklin, in my eyes, is the most underrated founding father, probably because he never served as president. During his lifetime, he made contributions as an author, scientist, musician, inventor, and political theorist, just to name a few. As minister to France during the Revolutionary War, it was Franklin who secured the alliance with the French after the Battle of Saratoga. Without this alliance, the Americans might not have been able to outlast the British. In September 1783, Britain and its soon-to-be former colonists entered into peace negotiations. The American delegation included John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay. The painting you see here is supposed to be of the American and British delegations in Paris in 1783. The British refused to pose, thus the painting went unfinished. The treaty granted America its independence. The borders of the new country stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, and from Canada in the north, where the British still resided, to Florida in the south. The questions facing this newly independent country involved how would it govern itself. In December 1783, George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief and retired to Mount Vernon, at least for now. We will look at the American government in its infancy from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution next time. And until then, good night, Albuquerque.